Welcome to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and their journey. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corkin here. I am the co-host of this show. And, if you check out the archives, we've got lots of great episodes with smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs from all kinds of companies. And I'm also the co-founder of the company Rise25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And you can go to our website at rise25.com and learn about what we do. And this episode is brought to you by EO San Francisco. EO San Francisco is the Bay Area chapter of Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a global peer-to-peer network of 20,000 influential business owners across 200 chapters, 60-plus countries. And if you are the founder, co-founder, owner, or controlling shareholder of a company generating over $1 million a year in revenue, and you want to connect with other like-minded, successful entrepreneurs, EO is for you. And the EO San Francisco chapter has about 130 members across all kinds of different industries. You can learn more about us at eonetwork.org/San Francisco. All right, my guest here today is Zahoor Kareem. He is a relatively newer member of the EO San Francisco chapter. He's a seasoned entrepreneur with a track record of acquiring different businesses across a number of different industries, which is kind of fascinating because he's looked at various different industries. And so we're going to learn about the world of M&A and acquiring different businesses. Zahoor, it's such a pleasure to have you here today. And I always like to start by hearing about what people were like as a kid. And you had a bunch of different ideas, but tell me about this one where you were interning in a hospital and you saw a business opportunity. You saw these nurses that were making money by basically recycling their juice cups for a nickel, and you saw an arbitrage opportunity. I love it.
I did. Well, thanks for having me. And that's correct. I was volunteering in the summer at a hospital in Calgary where I was for middle school and high school. And I noticed all the nurses collecting in garbage bags, like the leftover juice cups, right? They're like the tiny little juice cups with a little aluminum foil on top. And so out of curiosity, I asked the head nurse, and I said, "Why are you collecting these?" It's like, "Oh, because we just, at the end of the week, we take them to the recycling center and we get a bunch of money, and then we use it for fun stuff for the unit." And so my parents at the time ran a wholesale bakery, and they had a supplier, and I picked up the cup and I looked on the back of it and I was curious. And so I asked the distributor, I said, "Do you guys carry this cup?" And he happened to say that they did. And I said, "All right." And said, "How much is it?" And I don't remember the exact number, but it was something less than 5 cents at the time. And he said, "But you have to buy them in like boxes of 2000s." And I said, "Sure. Like, I'd like to buy a bunch of them." And thankfully, he didn't ask why. And
this is just buying them like the raw material, like
the raw material, the raw
unused.
cup. Yeah, I didn't even know this was such a thing. Like, you could literally buy the cup.
Yeah.
And, in my adult self and being more environmentally friendly probably wasn't the best thing to do. But So I ended up ordering, I don't know, thousands of these cups. And rather than just taking them to the recycling center and wondering why these were like unused, I would basically every day dump them into our bathtub at the time and add a bunch of Kool-Aid powder to it because it made like a color. And I would rinse them out and dry them and put them in a garbage bag. And then every week I would take them to the recycling center. And that was kind of my summer project of, earning, I don't know, a penny or two per cup.
You saw an opportunity. Yeah.
I did.
So you want to make sure that those recycling snoops didn't that rat you out, those guys. Yeah.
And it's funny. It's funny you asked about the story. I love that recycling business in Calgary, right? Because it was one of those where they just had a warehouse and they just collected a bunch of stuff. And they paid you pennies on it, and then they sold it to a larger company, right? And it was a really hard business to actually acquire. No one wants to sell them, but it was an interesting thing as a summer project.
Well, it gets back to kind of your thesis behind your investment now is simple concepts, and that's kind of like a simple concept, right? Buying
simple to me,
simple, right, exactly. So we could talk about that as it gets to your present day and the types of companies that you acquire. But you also had an idea to start a company that was like Webvan. For those who don't remember Webvan, explain what Webvan was, because it's an interesting idea from the early .com days.
Yeah, that might be a little too much credit for me, but yeah, Webvan from in the early .com days, probably the late 90s. in essence started, your what is it? Instacart was like the
Yeah, like
precursor to
grocery
Instacart,
delivery.
right? That
Yeah,
you could
yeah.
order groceries, and their model, which was flawed, is they started to build warehouses and host all this inventory everywhere. And my idea
That is
before all
super
this,
capital intensive.
right, my
Yeah.
idea before all this started was, well, what if you're busy and this is really pre-internet and you could just call a phone number and tell us what you wanted for your grocery orders and we would go do it for you and we charge you $5 to $10. Again, another kind of high school project. And it didn't get off the ground, but I literally printed flyers, went to the grocery store and put them up on a bunch of different cars and tried to see if it would work. And interestingly, it didn't work for better or for worse. Otherwise, I don't know how I would have then had to figure out how to actually solve the problem of, all right, I have your order now. Now I have to go to the store and find a way to pay
Buy
for
it.
it
Yeah.
and collect money and then make $5. But
But you weren't wrong that one day someone would be interested in this. Busy people would want someone to deliver their groceries for them.
yeah, and it's interesting. One of my tenets is I can start something from scratch, but I don't want to, nor do I like to, right? And
Mm.
and I've made that mistake a couple of times, but typically my SOP is find something that works and either clone it or make it better,
Mm.
right? I
Yeah.
don't have any I don't think I have any bright ideas. I ran businesses in college and I learned from what other people were doing and I put them out of business by doing
Mm.
it better, faster, cheaper than how they were doing it.
What other ones? So you had some other businesses during college.
Yes, I paid my way through college by I think it was I noticed at the beginning of the year that someone was selling t-shirts and I went to McGill, which is in Montreal, and it's probably a top 20
Yeah,
school
very well
worldwide,
respected
right?
school. Yeah.
And someone was selling in September a t-shirt with Harvard's logo on it, and underneath it said America's McGill. And I love the t-shirt, right? And so I'm like, oh, it's interesting. And I made a couple of phone calls. My parents had a friend of a friend that owned a screen printing company. And so I got him a logo and I printed Lord knows how many hundreds, maybe thousands of shirts. And I knew where all the new kids were going to be on campus because I was, part of the welcoming group. So I just set up a little table and we just sold these off for at that time, like $20 a shirt was a big deal 20
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah.
And it was just at the beginning of the year. I noticed that somebody else was, recording cassette tapes of a music class, right? So you could actually almost like study notes. And so
Yeah.
I figured this out and I went to talk to the professor before the class even started. I said, hey, can I have the recording in advance? Like, can
Mm.
I have your master? Because this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the library and I'm going to make copies so that not everybody has to go to the library to make their own copies. And he said, sure, here you go. And I made a bunch of these tapes and sold them off,
Mm.
$5 at a time. But the biggest business in college was I was going to Toronto with a friend who that friend is now turned into my wife, actually, of 25 years. And she's like, oh, I'm going to take this bus, but it's not Greyhound. And it's like $50 to go from Montreal to Toronto, which is probably a 4 or 5 hour drive. And I happened to sit at the front and I just peppered the operator with questions on the 4 hour drive. And they answered all of the questions I asked. So the next year, I'm like, I think I can do this as well. And so I ended up printing up a bunch of flyers, putting them up all around campus, charged $5 less.
Mm.
And partly was hard work, partly was luck because when their buses showed up, I sold out. They had some bad luck, but when their buses showed up, they were school buses, and mine showed up and they were full coaches. So after
Nicer.
the first event, they stopped providing the work. And every holiday, 2, 3 times a year, I would rent 2 to 3 Greyhound buses and I would sell them out.
These were
And
students that needed to like get home to Montreal
yeah, they
for
would
the
go to
break.
Toronto, and
Okay.
if you took Greyhound or the train, it was $100, and I was charging $55.
Yeah.
And
Much better
people
deal.
knew that it
Yeah.
was Zahoor's bus. And I'm like, it's not my bus, but that, like, to this day, like, people still remember
That's
that
funny.
bus service. And so that was another one of those, like, saw someone else do it, thought I'd give it a shot, and made it happen.
So you
So,
mentioned that your parents had a bakery.
mhm.
So I guess you maybe observed entrepreneurship up close. But what drove this? What drew, if you look introspectively, what drove you to start these different businesses? Was it you just wanted to get money in your pocket? Was it curiosity? What was it?
I think it was this no, it was a game, I think, more than anything else. Capital accumulation is a game, right? I think ultimately for me, it's like, how do you keep acquiring capital, not for my own good, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's to give it away, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's to help make the world a better place. I'm going to quote Michael Jackson. And so it was just an interesting model, right? Like even my passion for the equity markets, like I read everything I could find on like Buffett and Munger and Berkshire Hathaway
Mm-hmm.
in high school when I came across them, right? And so,
Yeah.
but my uncle was an entrepreneur, ran the largest budget rent-a-car franchise. My parents are professionals. Dad's a mechanical engineer. But we moved to Canada. They started becoming entrepreneurs, right? And so they ran businesses, but they were just happy running their business. It was just a job. It wasn't a business how I think of a business in terms of it making money for you. They were working in the business, right? Not
Mm.
on the business.
And did
And
that
so,
example inspire you to not want to work in businesses?
yeah, I mean, I didn't want to own a small business, right? Coming out of like working in the corporate world and having a steady check, like I didn't want something to be dependent on me. Like all of our acquisitions, I'm really involved with the first year. But if I get hit by a bus today, like the business still continues,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, they might have an issue when it comes time to like closing the books at the end of the month and, looking at some financial oversight, but the businesses don't rely on me. Like I like my flexibility and my freedom
Yeah.
and my time with my kids and my family. And so I don't like to be, my business partner's on the other side, right? Like he loves like knowing every single thing going on in the business, and I love him for it. Um, I'm on a need to know, and I don't need to know everything. So
Yeah. Yeah. So you, after college, you ended up moving to the Bay Area a couple of
Mhm.
years after college, I believe it was, with the goal of having the business you have today. But you found that it didn't exactly work out that way. So how'd you end up coming to the Bay Area,
So
and how did that work out?
so right after college, I wanted to acquire a business, and I was looking at a bunch of different businesses, and I was young and immature and didn't know what I knew now, and I passed on a couple of businesses, which would have been great, but at the time I thought they were too expensive. Like I thought the multiple of EBITDA or cash flows was really high, and I'm glad it worked out that I didn't buy anything because a year and a half later. I had a couple of mentors that said, tech's really big. Like this is now 2000. Like, why don't you start a tech company? I'm like, I don't know how to start things. I just know how to join things and
Yeah.
hopefully make them better. And so I came to the Bay Area to a job fair on like 24 hours notice,
Really?
landed at, midnight, San Jose, went to a Kinko's because those existed, printed my resume because that's still what you did back then.
What do you remember? What year this was?
This would have been in January or February of 2000.
Wow. Okay. Oh, this
And
is actually right before the peak, which was March of 2000, right?
I
Or
moved. I
2001.
again, no, no. I moved here right around the time the Nasdaq crashed in March of 2020.
March of 2020. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and so I
yeah.
came in
Sorry,
January or
20,
February.
2000, 2000.
Yeah.
You're
Oh,
saying. Yeah,
2000.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah,
Yes. Not COVID.
yeah.
And I looked at the job fair listings, and there was 50 companies that were there, and I said I want to meet these four companies. And I picked out companies either because they'd either just raised capital or the executive team was attractive. And I met those four companies. I got invited back a week later for interviews with all those four companies. And I think I got two job offers out of those four that I really wanted to meet with. And I picked the company that I liked the senior executive at, and they'd raised a bunch of money. And the long story short of it is that CEO that whose company I joined because of him ended up being on the board of the second company I was at, turned in from being a boss to a mentor to a very dear friend, like dear friend, as in he came to see my daughter when she was born in the hospital, dear
Wow.
friend.
Wow.
Um, and so, yes, I joined a software company that was, initially was doing things in the MP3 world, recording like pre-Zoom, right? They were recording streaming audio. Then they were doing some content management stuff. And so, yeah, so I was on the marketing side and business development side there for 3 years.
Yeah. So you worked in a variety of different roles: ops, finance, business
Mhm.
development. So it sounds like you hopped around kind of different companies during this period of time, about 15 years.
Correct.
And would you describe this time as, just kind of like learning the ropes or learning the tech world?
Yeah, I think I was on this path, right, of continuing either learning new things, step one, moving up the ladder, right? It was all back then it was like, how do I get to the next level, right? How do you get the next title? And
Yeah.
and how do you get the next raise, right? Because it's expensive to live in the Bay Area, and your
Yeah.
first job, you're making ends meet, and so yeah. So the second company I joined was in the e-commerce space, had some fantastic growth. I mean, I think the 7 year period I was there, it grew from 10 million to 200 million.
Wow.
And I got to take on lots of different roles there, fixing divisions, launching divisions, small M&A, large M&A, watching it go public, which was a great education, right? It was like an MBA on the job, right? So,
Yeah.
and figuring things out along the way, which was, you know, which I'm super grateful for that experience and for people pushing me to learn more and even stretch outside of my comfort level, right? Because they
You
trusted that I could figure it out.
you've since now you have a company where you've done acquisitions outside of the tech world.
Mhm.
What during that experience, that 15 years of working inside of the tech world, led you to an interest to not pursue that, but rather to acquire companies that are non-tech types of companies?
I think the premise when I started this was how do you generate double-digit returns for investors paid out on a regular basis? Because in the tech world, if you're in the venture world, you're raising a bunch of capital for an idea, and 5 to 10 years later, you go public and there's a return. If you're in the typical private equity world, the Blackstones, KKRs of the world, you acquire a company, you do a bunch of restructuring, you sell off pieces, you add a bunch of debt, and 7 years later, something happens and you return capital. And I didn't come out of the banking world, right? So I wasn't going to go raise $100 million fund. That wasn't necessarily an option. But the idea of telling people that, hey, this is going to generate returns for you on day one, right? You're believing in me, but your capital's actually going to generate a return on a quarterly basis was an attractive premise, right? So, and the fact that you were going to be able to generate 15 to 20% returns on your money, I thought was an interesting idea that people would gravitate towards and would want to participate in. Yeah.
Yeah. And you actually had a dinner party. So around the time you were going to leave the last company you worked for and you decided that you're going to do something else, you went to this dinner party and you had people, you basically saying, yeah, Zahor, we knew that you've always wanted to go acquire something. Or you tell the story, but you were asking, they were asking about what you were going to do next, and you
Yeah, I was
basically
having
revealed this
I,
is all the kind of the master plan. They all knew that that's what the master plan
they
was.
did. I'd looked at different companies to acquire and shared it and looked at it with a couple of really close friends. And so I was having this dinner probably in early 2015 at the time, and they'd asked that same question, what company, like, do I want to look for another company to join? What do I want to do? And I said, I'm actually going to look at acquiring a company and raising some capital. And they obviously, who knew me very well and had heard me talk about this for a long time, had said, what you've always been talking about. And in essence, at that dinner, the 3 or 4 people committed to participating and being the equity if I found the right deal. And so that kind of kicked off the races of identifying a company to potentially acquire. And it got introduced to a company that was doing last mile delivery services for FedEx Ground. Knew
Is that
nothing about the
something? Didn't know
space,
anything about that. Yeah.
didn't even
Oh,
know it existed. And I think
yeah.
every company I've acquired since with a partner, I never knew those businesses existed until they were brought in front of me. And so quickly ramped up and got my arms around it, understood that it kind of met the criteria I was looking for, right? It was consistent operating history, easy to understand, some form of management in place, minimal capital expenditures. I was wrong, by the way, in 3 out of those 4 things, but the premise, and I think I've been wrong in every deal that we've done. Like what I thought I knew is not what I knew after we acquired the companies.
So let's dwell on that first acquisition. So what were some of the bigger areas you were wrong? Like what needed to be fixed that you didn't think needed to be fixed?
So the idea that there's minimal capital expenditures, we acquired this company and FedEx Ground, which in essence was the only was the only client in essence. It was a master contract with
No,
FedEx Ground.
no, that's a
A,
challenge, right? But
a
like,
month after we acquire, this company that was delivering in, I don't know, 10 zip codes, a new rule came down and a new type of agreement came down where they forced us to repaint the entire fleet. Now, that's like a $50,000 expense
hmm
the first month after you take over an
yeah.
operation. Didn't realize that.
And there's nothing
So
you could do because that's your only customer. You
yeah,
had to comply.
no, I thought, yeah, I also learned very quickly that uh, they yielded a big bat, and I rustled a bunch of feathers and I shouldn't have.
Mm.
So one of my investors to this day, and it was a dear friend, said something to me which has stuck since that day. And he said, "You attract bees with honey."
Mm.
And that line has stuck with me because uh, I was the bull in the china shop because I was like, I'm your biggest provider in San Francisco. I don't have to do like I'm going to follow the letter of the law of the contract. And they weren't accustomed to anybody pushing back. And so as soon as someone's pushing back, they reminded me very quickly that they were the big dog on campus and they controlled everything, right? So we were doing an acquisition, they they railroaded it, we had to restructure it, and then I learned that we've got to play nice all the time. And so
Yeah. 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 Because that's a lot of client concentration if you have only one customer.
correct. And there's no option, right? Your trucks are branded FedEx Ground. You
Yeah.
can't deliver for Safeway at night,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
So that's a bit scary.
that scare factor is one of the reasons we divested as well of the business 7 years later.
Yeah.
At a healthy return, right? But we had a couple of tough years where, it's staffing related, right? And that truck needs to get out. And if it doesn't get out, your client is kicking and screaming, asking you how you're going to get it out the door.
Staffing
Uh,
related, like you didn't have a driver.
right. So if a driver
Yeah.
doesn't show up,
Yeah.
that truck is going to be reloaded with another 200 packages tomorrow. So you have to move those packages today somehow or the other. And so we had to, very quickly learn the additional expense of having spare drivers and having
Mm.
your managers be able to drive. Um, and while it's a consistent space, having one client who dictates your rates and your cost structure is not the business I wanted to be in longer term, right? So
Yeah.
we learned, it took us a while to figure that out, but we still made four more acquisitions in that space before figuring it out.
Before you divested. And then you also launched and then you closed an Amazon delivery service. Was this before Amazon started building their own delivery service? Because there was a long period of time where Amazon used a combination of, I think, UPS and US
Correct.
Postal Service before they built their own.
Correct. So this is when they had built their own, they called it their delivery service provider platform. And one of my old managers had left and was working for one such company and called. So it's like, we should do this. Like, you should do this. So made a few phone calls. We got an introduction, and instead of buying a fleet, we wanted to test it out for a year, and we rented vehicles. We rented a fleet of, I don't know, 20 vehicles, which was super expensive for a year to test it out. And it was an interesting experiment, which reminded me not to start something from scratch, right? Like again, there was a staffing issue, there was a fleet issue. Amazon, much to their claim for success is that they're super hyper focused and micromanage every aspect of it. And so ultimately, it wasn't really a separate business. Like they would control everything you do. What time did you show up? Did everything get delivered? What equipment do you use? What time are your people coming back? Right? Are they in uniform? Are they not? Right? And so,
So
and a
compared
year,
to FedEx, it was a lot more micromanagement.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so a year later, they tried to actually offer us a larger contract, to which we said no to and said, we're just going to cut our losses and move on.
You decided that you
Uh,
didn't want to be in this space.
no, and so it was call it not including my time, it was a six-figure loss, right?
Mm,
So
mm,
and we continued to kind of not necessarily just manage the FedEx business because it had continuously, the package world in e-commerce was continuing to grow at 7 to 10% a year, and so we were we you know we were lucky in terms of that we looked ahead a little bit, right, and saw that FedEx was going to start to cram margins down, but they also wanted to build more concentration in terms of the zip codes that you delivered in. And partially hard work, partially good luck. We restructured the zip codes that we had going into COVID to focus on residential only and got out of the business zip
Urban
codes,
core. Interesting. Yeah.
which again worked. Like, we didn't have to lay anybody off. Our volumes went up 50%. We were sending volume to other companies that had nothing to do during COVID because they were
Mm,
delivering to the financial district, and there
mm,
was no one in the financial district at the time.
yeah.
And so,
That's
um,
fascinating. I've interviewed other companies like this that in other spaces that unintentionally, you know, ended up being well positioned for the COVID downturn, not even realizing that that would be a thing. Because there's other
yeah,
companies that would think like, oh, we just want to focus on urban core, and they don't realize how much risk they put that in, going
yeah,
into a thing like a pandemic.
yeah. And we knew that delivering to businesses was also a pain point in the logistics side, right? Because you're delivering to a business that you're trying to find parking, you're delivering large volumes of product to one individual, which means the profit margin's a lot less. You've got massive, we are spending $10,000 a month on parking tickets, right? In San
Wow.
Francisco. And so kind of that shift of going from 11 zip codes all over the place to like, I think it was 4 zip codes in core residential areas in San Francisco was, good stroke of planning. And then we got lucky with COVID. I don't
Yeah.
think you can say that very often, but
Yeah, when COVID started to happen, was there a moment, was there a period of time, a couple of weeks where you were, petrified, where you felt like it was all going to unwind, or no?
I was on the other side of the world, traveling with my family for a year,
Wow.
when COVID hit. And so we never, on the business side of it, ever had to shut down because it was deemed to be an essential service. So it was
Mm,
just status quo. For us, it was more, you know, make sure everybody's masked, right? You're not really engaging with a customer because you're doing a delivery to the door. The rules became really easy, right? It's like, hey, you don't need a signature for anything, right? Like,
yeah, yeah,
you're just delivering the package, right? I mean, if
yeah,
it's alcohol, you still need a signature. But outside of that, it was still like drop something off and keep going. And
yeah.
so we actually saw a very big increase in volumes, about 50% within our delivery areas. And because they were deliveries to the home, packages were smaller, which means we didn't have to add more people,
Mm,
right? Our vehicles just got more efficient. And so
mm.
we got really lucky that there were no business, like the business continued just as if it was normal.
Yeah, wow. So at some point you decide that you're going to divest of this, sell off this business, and you decide to move into a new industry. How did you
Correct.
evaluate what industry you would go into next?
So the idea was that we would always do another acquisition, but I did 4 in a span of, call it 15 months, and then didn't do another one for 7 years, or for
Mm,
five, roughly, what are we in 25? Yeah, roughly 5 years, I didn't do another one.
mm,
And then in the process of looking at other businesses, it was, my now business partner, who was initially just a passive investor on the logistics side, and I started working together. I couldn't tell you how that happened. He was curious about what I was doing and the returns, and I shared because I have no secrets. And somewhere along the line, we started working together. And I think he came across the business and said, "Do you know anything about this?" And he's got a real estate background, and he was kind of intrigued by this. And he said, "Do you know anything about the water and fire mitigation?" I said, "Nope, but let's look at it."
hmm.
And we had initially looked at this, our first acquisition, and it was already under contract. So we forgot about it. And then I think it was 2 months later, the broker called back and said, "Hey, it fell out of contract for, the buyer couldn't get the right financing. Are you guys still interested?" And so we said, "Sure, let's dig in and, and put in an offer." And so we started looking at it. And again, it kind of met the criteria, right? Which in hindsight, we're all wrong. Consistent operating history, easy to understand, minimal capex, some form of management in place. And 3 out of the 4 after we got into it were all wrong,
And what were the
right?
biggest ones that were off?
So one was consistent operating history, right? If you as a customer have a water loss because a pipe broke in your house, you're likely, hopefully, never calling me back, right? It happens once to you. It's not like
Yeah.
your water pipe in your fridge is going to break every 3 months.
Yeah.
So that's one, right? You basically have a customer once. That's what first learning. The second one was um, ServPro, which was the franchisor, had been acquired by Blackstone a year or two before we got into the business. And they wanted to add more franchisees. And so they were selling off more territories. And we quickly realized after the fact that we had acquired Palo Alto, Redwood City, Atherton, but they were doing a ton of revenue outside of those zip codes. But now all of a sudden, someone else had that zip code.
Mm.
And so that was another key learning. And then the third one was is that the seller who was exiting stage left really managed a lot of the day-to-day operations, and there were no redundancies with their core people.
Mm.
And so it took us about a year and a half to build some redundancies as the business got larger. And then, you know, there was not a lot of capex, but the first two about the consistent operating history was the key, the big aha moment going, nope, there isn't. Like if you move into the commercial side, there is a little bit more consistency, right? If you have a property manager that has 1,000 units, they're calling you every month because something's wrong somewhere
Right.
every month, right?
Right.
So
But you were in residential only.
at the time, they
Yeah.
were in residential only. And if I look at it now, 5 years later, four acquisitions later, we're just starting to identify a commercial sales rep and start to recruit for one to try to build a book of commercial business. Probably do about 20% commercial today,
Mm.
with some large corporate clients. But again, it's not super consistent.
Yeah. So you figured these pieces out along the way. And did
Correct.
you stay with the franchise model with acquiring franchises?
Correct. So we did. So we acquired under the ServPro umbrella, which is a franchisor, we acquired two territories from an existing operator. A year later, we acquired another territory. And then I think about 6 months after that, we acquired two more territories from another operator that were still under the ServPro umbrella. So it was great. We could just consolidate them.
So it's kind
Uh,
of easier, a little more cookie cutter type of approach that way. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. They
Yeah.
just get turned in under the same parent company umbrella and just it's one payroll system,
Right.
it's
And how is
one.
that working? In some ways, there could be similarities to the FedEx world where someone else, some other company kind of controls your butt and they change the rules of the road. There's not much you can do about it. How
So,
has that been being underneath, a larger company where they dictate a lot of the rules for you?
it's great because they're a typical franchisor, right? And then the regular franchisor franchisee model, you know, in the FedEx world is very different. I wouldn't call it, it acts like a franchise model, but it's not, right? They consider
Yeah.
you a third-party service provider. And so they're always threatening your contract, right? In the ServPro world, they're your partners, right? They're
Hmm.
sending you leads. They have corporate accounts. They have corporate clients. They provide support. They provide training.
And it's a
They have a
very mature franchisor model.
they have a
Yeah.
technology platform that they're constantly updating and improving. They hold an annual conference where they bring everybody together to do continuing education.
Yeah.
It's great. It's a ton of support, and
Mm.
the phone rings because you are a ServPro operator, right?
Yeah.
So people know on the residential side that they're one of the two major players in the residential side, and now they're growing in the commercial side. And so, yeah, it's been a great place to be, because again, it's an essential service, right? So even during COVID, we actually closed on the acquisition in the middle of COVID,
Mm.
and it didn't skip a beat. Like,
Mm.
it continued because the type of work changed a little bit. But we still kept everybody, we didn't have any layoffs and kept everybody occupied.
Right, right. Now we talked about this before the interview, but you kind in some ways like there are these categories in the acquisitions world, private equity, there's a search fund, but you're kind of neither of those. Do you find it's hard to explain to people what you are or to define
Yeah,
who you are or what your company is?
yeah, I think it depends who I meet, right? If I'm just meeting somebody on the street to say, what do I do? I may just simplify and say I manage X, Y, and Z company.
Yeah.
If I'm having a longer conversation, I will keep it simple and say, I manage a private equity fund and we acquire small to mid-sized companies. If I meet somebody who's super well versed, I'll tell them we run a search fund. And so I think it just depends on the audience, right?
Yeah.
But to simplify it, we acquire non-tech operating companies, and typically where a seller is exiting, doesn't have family and or kids who want to take over, and they want to exit stage left,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And now you're looking even in other areas as well. So now you've been looking into the education space and the healthcare space.
Correct.
I guess I'm just so curious about like how you can manage this to move from one industry to another industry to another industry
Right.
without the background or experience in these areas.
Yeah, and I think you know it, I don't think I don't think I'm special in any shape, way, or form, right? I think it's just my brain is wired to be able to understand lots of things very quickly. And apologies for the cuckoo clock that's going to ring 11 times, I think.
I don't
Um,
hear it.
and I think I say no very quickly to a deal, right? Usually within the first 5 minutes, I will say yes or no. If I say
Mhm.
yes, then we'll dig deeper. Um, and usually it's what's in my circle of competence. What can I understand and grasp really quickly? Uh, and one of my favorite business people or companies, I should say, is Berkshire Hathaway, right? So operated by Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, who's now since passed. And they've got 50, 60 companies in their portfolio, right? Granted, they're much larger, but that's kind of been the model, right? Like he gets a phone call and someone says, I have this company to sell, and they say
Yeah.
yes or no, and then they dig a little deeper. And so when we're looking at kind of the next acquisition to get, it's always been business services, education, and healthcare. And we've identified, a company in the healthcare space, and I won't share the name, but the premise is that that they provide, assisted daily living support in the home, right? To individuals, and so it kind of checks off the criteria of consistent operating history, easy to understand, minimal capital expenditures, right? But
Whether
then the
those
other,
come to fruition or not, right?
correct.
Yeah.
But right,
Yeah.
but the other tying thing is that if I look at the water and fire mitigation business and this home health business, they're actually in the business of giving people hope. It sounds a little cheesy to say, but
Mm.
like when our phone rings when you're sitting in a puddle of water or you've had a fire or you've got mold, right? Like you
You're
call
coming to help.
us,
You're
we're
coming to
coming
help.
to help,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so ultimately, and I remind this to our teams often, right? Like not that we're in the helping people business, but I take it a step further, right? To This is a long answer to your question of like, you know, what are we in the business of, right? Like we're actually in the business of taking care of our people, right? And if we can take care of our people by making sure that they have a roof over their head and food on the table and they can build their families and be successful, they'll take care of your customers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for
Because
sure.
to me, for all of our companies over time, success is when your employees' kids go to college and the kids go, "Hey, mom and dad, how did you pay for college?" And they say, "Well, I worked for a company that took care of me,"
Yeah.
right? And so not directly the question you asked, but I think getting a handle, I can understand lots of different companies pretty quickly. If the company is public, I probably know about it. I spent a lot of time making investments in the equity markets as well, and in a wide variety of companies. And if I understand them very quickly, I don't know how or why, but it makes sense in my brain, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
and also there's the understanding over time that people are really the key to any business, right? And
Yeah.
so that's super important.
Yeah. Zahor, this has been great. Where can people go to learn more about you? Is there anywhere they can go? Because I know
That,
that
that
this is
that's
like
a
kind of your
trick
coming out
question.
party.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I will commit to doing is we need to have, you know, we need to actually set up a website sooner rather than later for K&L Capital or our holding companies. I need to update my LinkedIn profile with a little bit more detail because it doesn't have a lot on it. I've tended to hide in the shadows. Our operating companies do really good work. Our people do really good work, and I help to navigate and provide, high fives in the background. And I am not have not typically been a very public person. And so, but
I appreciate you coming out and sharing your story here today, because I'm sure it'll inspire someone. And you've learned a lot, and I appreciate you sharing some of that wisdom.
Thank you. I appreciate the time, John.
Zahoor, thanks so much.
All right. Chat soon.
Thanks for listening to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast. This episode is powered by Rise 25. Please subscribe and check out future episodes.